It was just past midnight in the quiet suburbs of Richmond, Virginia. The streets were mostly empty except for the occasional parked car or the soft glow of porch lights flickering behind curtains. A gentle wind rustled through the trees lining Maplewood Drive, and the only real sound was the distant hum of a transformer buzzing atop a power line. The calmness of the night was almost eerie, the kind that made every small noise echo a little louder than usual. Driving through that stillness was a sleek black SUV, moving at a steady, cautious pace. Behind the wheel sat Melinda Hayes, a 42-year-old black woman with sharp eyes, smooth mahogany skin, and a presence that spoke of both strength and composure. She was dressed modestly, dark jeans, a fitted jacket, and simple earrings that shimmered faintly under the cabin lights. Her fingers rested calmly on the steering wheel, and her posture was upright but relaxed. From the outside, she looked like any professional woman heading home after a long day. But Melinda Hayes was no ordinary woman. To anyone on the street, she was just another commuter in a suburban neighborhood. Her vehicle bore Virginia license plates. Her address on paper matched an apartment complex a few blocks away. Her ID checked out, her driving record was clean, and her demeanor was as calm as a Sunday morning. But what no one knew, not the neighbors, not the clerk at the nearby grocery store, and certainly not the two police officers about to pull her over, was that Melinda Hayes was a deep-cover CIA operative who had been working in Richmond for the past 11 months. Her mission was classified, her operations were covert, and every step she took was calculated with precision. That night she had been returning from a drop-off, a routine handoff of encrypted data at a safe house located in an abandoned industrial park outside the city. It had gone smoothly as expected. The moment she merged onto Maplewood Drive, she felt the weight of her assignment begin to lift. Her role in the mission was nearly complete, and within 48 hours, she was scheduled to leave Virginia for good. She had done her job, gathered the intelligence, avoided detection, and navigated layers of corruption embedded within the local system. But just as she approached a dimly lit intersection, her instincts flared. She eased to a full stop at the blinking red light. Her eyes scanned the rearview mirror. At first, nothing seemed off. A few homes with security lights, a parked sedan, a dog barking 2 houses down. But then headlights appeared in the distance, first dim, then blinding, as they quickly closed in. Within seconds, the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights lit up the rear window of her SUV, followed by the sharp wail of a siren piercing the silence. Melinda didn't panic. She didn't even blink. Years of field training had prepared her for far worse. She simply exhaled slowly and pulled over to the side of the road, positioning her car neatly between 2 street lamps. She turned off the ignition and reached into her glove compartment for her license and registration. Her motions were deliberate, her face expressionless. She already suspected what was happening, but she would let it play out. The patrol car stopped just inches behind her. 2 white officers stepped out. One tall and broad-shouldered, walking with the heavy-footed confidence of someone who thought he had nothing to fear. The other shorter, stockier, with the posture of a man used to backing up bad decisions. Their names wouldn't be known to her until later, but they were Detective Sean Travers and Officer Kyle Bentantu, members of the local force, with a reputation for aggressive policing and an uncanny record of high-profile drug arrests. As they approached, flashlights in hand, Melinda rolled down her window halfway. "Good evening, Mom," said the taller officer, his voice smooth, but vaguely condescending. "Do you know why we pulled you over tonight?" Melinda met his gaze without a flicker of emotion. "No, officer. I stopped at the sign back there and wasn't speeding." The officer offered a thin smile. "Actually, you failed to come to a complete stop. That's a moving violation." Melinda nodded slowly. "I see." And just like that, the wheels were set in motion. What these officers believed would be a simple power play over a woman they assumed had no leverage would soon unravel into the biggest scandal their department had ever faced. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the woman sitting calmly in the driver's seat wasn't the vulnerable target they thought she was. She was a trained operative, and every move they were about to make had already been anticipated. Officer Sean Travers took a small step back, as if giving Melinda space, but the intensity in his eyes suggested something else entirely. His partner, Officer Kyle Benton, circled behind the SUV, casually shining his flashlight along the bumper and tail lights. It was all for show, This wasn't a stop about a rolling stop sign. This was a setup. "License and registration, please, Travers," said, his tone turning sharper. Without hesitation, Melinda handed him both documents. Her license listed a nearby address. Her registration was current. Everything was in order. But that didn't matter. Travers wasn't looking for a traffic citation. He was looking for control. "You live around here?" he asked as he examined her ID. "Yes, officer," Melinda replied evenly. There was no sign of fear in her voice, no shakiness in her hands. If anything, her composure was unsettling. She wasn't giving them the satisfaction they were clearly fishing for. Behind the SUV, Officer Benton suddenly called out, "Hey, Travers, you'll want to see this." Melinda's stomach tightened, not in fear but in awareness. Her instincts clicked into gear. She knew what was coming before Travers even handed back her documents. "Step out of the vehicle," Mom Travers ordered. "Why?" Melinda asked calmly. "We have reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances." The line was delivered cold and rehearsed like something memorized from a police training manual. It was also a lie. Melinda gave a faint sigh and opened the door. She stepped out slowly, deliberately making sure to keep her hands where they could see them. She didn't resist, didn't argue. She had been in more dangerous situations overseas, in war zones and intelligence briefings where lives hung in the balance. Compared to those, this was small time, but it still needed to be handled carefully. Officer Benton theatrically opened the trunk of her SUV. Inside, placed right near the front edge perfectly too visible, was a small, unmarked nylon bag. "Well, well," Benton said with mock surprise. "What do we have here?" Melinda's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. That bag hadn't been there when she left her apartment. She was certain of it. Travers smirked as he approached the trunk. "Care to explain this?" he asked, gesturing toward the bag. "I've never seen that before," Melinda replied. "Of course not," Benton scoffed. "They never have." Travers reached in, unzipped the bag, and pulled out a clear pouch filled with a white, powdery substance. "Looks like we hit the jackpot," he said, holding it up for effect. The streetlight overhead cast a dramatic glow on the scene, as if nature itself was calling attention to the act of corruption in progress. Melinda folded her arms across her chest and spoke clearly. "You're making a mistake." Travers stepped in close, his voice low and smug. "Lady, the only mistake you made was thinking we wouldn't find it." With that, Benton moved in and roughly turned Melinda around. He yanked her arms behind her back and slapped on the cuffs. The metal was cold and tight against her wrists. Still, she didn't flinch. Her voice, though soft, held a quiet intensity. "I suggest you be very sure about what you're doing," she said. Benton snorted. "Oh, we're sure." "Real sure." Travers leaned into her ear. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." The patrol car doors opened with a mechanical groan, and Melinda was guided into the back seat. The world outside her window drifted by slowly as they drove. Streetlights flashed over her face like camera shutters. The hum of the engine, the radio chatter, the occasional chuckle from the front seats. It had all created a surreal rhythm, but her mind was far from the present. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead. She knew how corruption worked. It didn't start with large crimes. It began with small violations, minor cover-ups, planted bags, falsified reports, and snowballed into patterns that infected entire departments. Officers like Travers and Benton didn't just break the law. They counted on the system protecting them. They counted on fear, silence, and the public assuming the worst about women who looked like her. But Melinda wasn't part of their equation. Hidden beneath the inner lining of her coat was a GPS-enabled distress beacon, standard issue for covert operatives. During the trunk search, while the officers were focused on their performance, she had subtly activated the device. It sent a silent signal to her team, no audio, no lights, just a quiet electronic pulse that traveled across secured networks. They would find her. That was never in question. The only unknown was how far Travers and Benton would go before their world collapsed around them. Back at the station, Melinda was led through sterile tiled hallways under flickering fluorescent lights. Travers strutted ahead, waving the plastic evidence bag like a trophy. Benton followed closely behind, radiating smug satisfaction. The other officers barely looked up. It was just another drug bust, just another dangerous black suspect brought in before dawn. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The station was quiet, almost too quiet. Melinda Hayes was guided into a small processing room that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The walls were scuffed, the linoleum floors worn down from years of heavy boots and indifference. Officer Benton stood with folded arms as his partner Travers removed the cuffs and handed her over to the night shift processing clerk, a younger officer named Daniel Keller. Keller had only been on the force for 6 months. At 24, he still carried a boyish look and the earnest energy of someone who believed in the badge. But something about this arrest didn't sit right with him. He glanced at Melinda as she stepped forward to be fingerprinted. Her posture was upright. Her hands moved with precision without panic. She didn't fidget, didn't plead. Most people in her position were either furious or terrified. She was neither. "Name," he asked, quietly dipping her fingers into the ink pad. "Melinda Hayes," she answered calmly. "Occupation?" There was a moment's pause. Melinda looked him dead in the eye. "Consultant." It was a half-truth, deliberately vague, but not a lie. Keller hesitated, sensing something beneath the surface. He typed her answer into the system, his hands slowing as he reviewed her ID and recent address. Everything checked out, yet nothing felt normal. Meanwhile, Travers and Benton stood across the room, laughing under their breath. "Easy money," Benton muttered, nudging his partner. She folded like a lawn chair. Melinda heard them, but didn't react. She had more important things on her mind. She scanned the room without turning her head, counting exits, spotting security cameras, gauging where the desk sergeant kept the keys. Every detail was stored away, processed with the cold efficiency of a trained field operative. Officer Keller glanced toward the evidence bag sitting on the counter. The pouch of white powder. The arrest report claimed Melinda had been nervous, that she had consented to a search, and that the substance had been in plain view. But that's not what Keller saw in her demeanor. She hadn't looked nervous. She had looked prepared. Her eyes weren't darting. They were assessing. Her answers weren't defensive. They were measured. Something didn't add up. That night, Keller couldn't sleep. After his shift ended, he sat in his small apartment and pulled out his personal laptop. He couldn't access restricted files from home, but he could review public arrest records tied to Travers and Benton. Within an hour, a pattern emerged: dozens of arrests over the past year, all involving Black or Latino suspects, nearly all traffic stops turned drug charges, nearly all based on consent and vague probable cause. It was a script, a formula, and it was rotten. Back at the precinct, Melinda waited in her holding cell, an 8x10 concrete room with one metal bench and a narrow slit of a window up high on the wall. The air was cold and dry. She didn't mind. She had endured worse. What mattered was time. The distress beacon she'd activated earlier was working. She knew it. Her team would be tracking her by now, but they wouldn't storm in, guns blazing. That wasn't protocol. They would observe. They would monitor the chain of custody, and when the moment was right, they would descend with precision. That meant she had a role to play: the silent patient detainee, the misunderstood suspect, the woman who looked harmless until it was too late. Officer Keller returned to work that morning with a knot in his stomach. He couldn't shake what he'd seen. He walked past Melinda's cell and paused. She was sitting upright on the bench, calm as ever, her hands folded in her lap. He swallowed hard. "You don't seem like the others," he said softly. Melinda turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze through the bars. "Because I'm not." Keller glanced around to make sure no one was watching. Did you really consent to the search?" Melinda studied him. His eyes weren't hardened yet. He still believed in rules. In doing the right thing. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" she asked. He looked away. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just being paranoid." "No," she replied. "You're waking up." Those 3 words hit him like a hammer. He stood in silence for a moment, then turned and walked away. But her voice followed him, quiet, steady, powerful. "That bag wasn't mine," she called after him. "And if you dig a little deeper, you'll see they've done this before." That night, Keller stayed late. After Travers and Benton left the station, he slipped into the records archive. He reviewed body cam files, arrest logs, internal memo, everything he could without triggering alarms. What he found made his blood run cold. Dozens of arrest reports had identical phrasing. Some body cam footage was conveniently corrupted, and the evidence logs manipulated. It was no longer just a hunch. It was a pattern of abuse. He had a choice to make. Across town, in a nondescript federal office building, the signal from Melinda's beacon had reached its mark. The CIA knew exactly where she was. and they were watching every step, every document, every officer. They had eyes on the station, and soon the entire web of lies would begin to unravel. Officer Daniel Keller barely slept that night. The weight of what he had uncovered pressed heavily on his chest. His conscience, once clean and obedient, now rumbled with a storm of doubt and growing conviction. By the time the morning shift rolled around, Keller had made his decision. He wasn't going to be just another silent witness. At 7:43 a.m., Keller used a secure communications terminal in the evidence room, one typically reserved for interagency contact, to send an encrypted message. It was addressed to a federal reporting line maintained for whistleblowers and law enforcement. In the subject line, he typed "Pattern of misconduct, Arlington PD urgent." Attached were digital copies of arrest records, screenshots from internal systems, and a written account detailing the suspicious arrest of Melinda Hayes. He didn't name Travers and Benton directly in the body of the message, but the files spoke volumes. 22 minutes later, in an unassuming building tucked into a quiet block of Washington, D.C., a red alert flashed across a CIA operations console. Melinda's beacon had been active for nearly 12 hours, long enough for protocol to shift from passive observation to operational engagement. Agent Carson Price, a 58-year-old senior field operative with a clean suit, steel gray hair, and zero tolerance for departmental corruption, glanced at the alert. His eyes narrowed. He didn't need to read the full report to understand. Melinda had been compromised, but not by enemy agents, by local law enforcement. "Get the team ready," he said, standing from his desk. "We move at 9. By 9:05 a.m., a black government SUV pulled up outside the Arlington Police Department. Inside were 3 federal agents, all dressed in crisp black suits, their badges clipped to their belts. They entered the station quietly, but their presence drew immediate attention. Conversations slowed. Coffee cups paused midair. The lead agent stepped to the front desk and calmly addressed the duty sergeant. "Special Agent Carson Price, Central Intelligence Agency. We're here regarding a federal matter. We need access to your holding cells and all evidence related to a suspect named Melinda Hayes." The sergeant blinked. "CIA." "Yes, sir," Price replied, handing over credentials. "She's not who you think she is, and this isn't going to be a routine morning." Behind them, the other 2 agents spread out, one heading toward the back offices, the other toward the surveillance room. They moved with practiced precision, polite but firm. Inside the command room, systems lit up as they accessed internal logs, scanned body cam footage, and cross-checked arrest data. In the bullpen, Travers and Benton were just finishing their second cups of coffee when they noticed the silence fall over the station. They stood when they saw the federal agents. "What the hell is this?" Benton muttered, shifting uneasily. Keller was at his desk. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His heart pounded as he watched Agent Price step directly toward the 2 officers. "Detective Travers?" "Officer Benton," Price said, his voice calm but sharp. "We'd like a word with you. Please come with us." Travers forced a smirk. "Yeah, what's this about?" "You know exactly what it's about," Price replied. "Let's not make a scene." The smirk faded. The 2 officers exchanged glances and followed the agents down the hallway. Back in the interrogation room, Travers and Benton were seated at a narrow table beneath a buzzing fluorescent light. Agent Price stood opposite them, hands folded. "Let's talk about the bag you claim to have found in Ms. Hayes' trunk," he began. "Everything's in the report," Travers replied, keeping his tone defensive but casual. "Yes. And your body cam footage confirms you were near the vehicle long before the search officially began," Price said, placing still images on the table, timestamps included. "That violates protocol. You knew there were no drugs in her car because you put them there." "That's a lie," Benton snapped. "This is entrapment." "No, Officer," Price replied, cold and steady. "This is justice. You messed with the wrong woman." He pulled out a small device and pressed a button. A recording began to play, grainy at first, but clear enough to make out voices. "Easy bust. Just tuck it near the edge of the trunk, play it like she panicked." It was their voices. The recording had been captured by Melinda's hidden surveillance mic embedded in the lining of her coat. Benton's face drained of color. Travers clenched his jaw, his composure crumbling. Outside the interrogation room, the station buzzed with confusion. Keller sat in silence as agents moved through the department, collecting physical and digital evidence. His fellow officers stared as Travers and Benton were walked out of the building, handcuffed, silent, and visibly shaken. Melinda was released moments later. Agent Price personally walked to her cell and opened the door. "Miss Hayes," he said, "you're free to go. We're done here." Melinda stepped out with quiet dignity. She glanced toward Keller, who stood near the front desk, watching the scene unfold. Their eyes met. She gave him a single nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but meaningful. Keller nodded back, swallowing the lump in his throat. For the first time since joining the force, he felt like he'd done something that mattered. In the hours that followed, news of the arrest began to spread like wildfire. Local reporters arrived before noon. By evening, national outlets had picked up the story. CIA agent framed by local cops, FBI intervenes in stunning takedown, read one headline. The Arlington Police Department was thrown into crisis. Internal Affairs opened investigations into every arrest made by Travers and Benton over the last 3 years. Many cases were already being re-examined. Several officers resigned. Others lawyered up. Agent Price made one final stop before leaving town. He returned to Keller's desk. "You did the right thing," he said simply. "You may not realize it yet, but this moment, you'll never forget it." Keller nodded. "I already don't." Meanwhile, Melinda sat in the back of the SUV that carried her away from the station. She stared out the window, watching the morning sun glint off the city skyline. Another mission completed. Another corrupt wall torn down. Justice had arrived. And it didn't knock, it kicked the door in. The arrest of Detective Travers and Officer Benton sent shockwaves through the Arlington Police Department and beyond. By nightfall, the quiet precinct that had once operated like a closed circle was thrown into complete disarray. The image of two white officers being led out of their own department in handcuffs, while the black woman they had tried to frame walked free, played over and over on cable news and social media feeds across the country. "Systemic abuse exposed in Arlington PD," read the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen on CNN. CIA agent falsely arrested, corrupt officers taken down in stunning federal sting, declared the Washington Post's front page the next morning. For the citizens of Arlington, it was a moment of collective reckoning. And for Officer Daniel Keller, it was the most transformative day of his life. He sat alone that evening in the modest kitchen of his apartment, still wearing his uniform shirt, the top button undone. The adrenaline had finally worn off, leaving behind a strange silence. His inbox was flooded with messages, some anonymous, others not. Some thanked him for stepping up. Others warned him to watch his back. But what weighed most heavily on him wasn't fear or even pride. It was the understanding that nothing would ever go back to the way it was. The next morning, Keller returned to the precinct to find the atmosphere heavy with suspicion. Conversations hushed when he entered the room. A few officers offered curt nods. Others avoided eye contact altogether. There were whispers behind closed doors. He had become the department's quiet center of controversy, not because he had lied, but because he had told the truth. Captain Monroe, the precinct's commanding officer, called him into his office mid-morning. "You made the right call," Monroe said, his expression grave. "But understand this, right doesn't always mean popular. It'll be tough for a while. People don't like having their silence broken." "I didn't join to be popular," Keller said. "I joined to serve the public." Monroe nodded slowly, clearly measuring his next words. "Keep your eyes open, Keller. You've got integrity, but that can make you a target. If you need anything, come to me first." The offer felt genuine, but Keller knew he was walking a tightrope now, between reform and rejection, between the old guard and whatever came next. Meanwhile, across town in a quiet federal office, Melinda Hayes sat in front of a large mahogany desk. Her coat was neatly draped over the back of her chair, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Opposite her sat Agent Carson Price, reviewing a set of debriefing documents. "You could have called us sooner," Price said without looking up. "I had to let it play out," Melinda replied. "You know how this works. Exposing the pattern required patience. If it'd blown my cover too early, Travers and Benton would have walked free, and the department would have buried it all." Price looked up and nodded. "Still dangerous." "I've faced worse," she said with a faint smile. He studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "The mission's complete. You're cleared to go back under, but I'd understand if you wanted time off. What you pulled off, most agents wouldn't have had the discipline to wait that long, especially with cuffs on their wrists." Melinda shook her head gently. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's slow, methodical, and sometimes it starts with one rookie officer asking the right question. Price smirked. Speaking of which, Keller. You impressed him. He impressed me, she replied. He didn't look the other way. That's rare. Back at the station, Keller stood outside on the sidewalk as reporters camped nearby attempted to shove microphones into his face. He gave no comment. He wasn't interested in fame, and certainly not in being a political symbol. He just wanted things to change for the better. Later that week, the department held a press conference. The police chief issued a formal apology. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale review of every arrest linked to Travers and Benton. Community leaders were invited into advisory meetings. Town hall forums were scheduled. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement, real, visible change. Keller remained in his post but requested a transfer to the Community Integrity Division, a newly formed unit meant to address internal misconduct. The paperwork was approved within 48 hours. Some colleagues still saw him as a traitor. Others had begun to see him as the officer they wished they could be. Either way, he had found his path. Melinda, meanwhile, boarded a train headed south just a few days after the fallout. She traveled light, just a single duffel bag and a leather-bound folder containing her next mission. She preferred train rides over planes when time allowed. There was something about watching the landscape blur past that made transitions feel smoother. As the train rumbled forward, she sipped from a steaming cup of black coffee and flipped through the new dossier. Another small town. Another tip about deep-rooted injustice. A new identity to adopt. A new assignment to execute quietly. She didn't crave recognition. She wasn't after revenge. She had learned long ago that justice wasn't about grand speeches or medals. It was about impact. It was about the single mother released from jail because her conviction was overturned. It was about the rookie officer who dared to speak up and now had a desk where his silence used to be. It was about the weight lifted inch by inch from communities too long burdened by fear. She closed the folder, leaned back, and allowed herself a rare moment of quiet. Justice, she knew, was never finished. It just moved. In the weeks that followed the arrests of Detective Sean Travers and Officer Kyle Benton, the city of Arlington found itself thrust into a national spotlight. What had started as a routine traffic stop ended up exposing not just the misconduct of two officers, but the structural rot that had festered quietly beneath the surface of the department for years. Public reaction was swift and intense. Protesters gathered outside the police station holding signs that read, "Accountability now, justice for the frame and end corruption." Some had never protested before in their lives, retirees, teachers, Vietnam veterans, but this case struck a nerve. It wasn't just about race or power, it was about betrayal, about how the system they had paid taxes into, trusted to protect them, had instead been weaponized against the innocent. In a televised press conference, the mayor of Arlington called the revelations deeply disturbing and promised an independent investigation led by the state's attorney general. The police chief, once reluctant to acknowledge wrongdoing, now stood beneath the weight of political and public pressure. He announced immediate policy changes, the suspension of all pending cases involving Travers and Benton, a full audit of their arrests over the past 5 years, and mandatory body cam reviews by third-party reviewers. The FBI and CIA, meanwhile, kept a lower profile. Aside from a brief joint statement confirming Melinda Hayes' undercover status and the successful coordination with federal authorities, they offered no further comment. Melinda's name was intentionally kept out of the official record, a decision made to preserve both her operational security and her personal life. In the public eye, she remained a mystery, a symbol, more than a person. But within law enforcement circles, the story of what she had done spread like wildfire. Officers from neighboring jurisdictions, Black, white, Latino, spoke her name in hushed tones of respect. Some departments even began using her case in internal ethics training. The message was clear: corruption could no longer hide behind routine, and no one was beyond accountability. The legal consequences for Travers and Benton were severe. Within a month, both men were indicted on multiple federal charges, including obstruction of justice, falsifying reports, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. During the trial, the jury was shown footage from the police station audio of the officers mocking Melinda, planting evidence and boasting about past arrests. But it was the moment when Melinda's voice calmly, confidently identified the flaws in their tactics that seemed to strike the jury the hardest. They were both found guilty on all counts. Benton was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Travers, due to a longer history of complaints and internal reprimands, received 25 years without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was packed the day the verdict was read. Reporters lined the back wall. Keller was there too, sitting quietly near the exit. He never said a word to the press. But when the gavel dropped and the sentence was read, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Several of their past convictions were overturned. Over 24 individuals, mostly Black and Latino men, were released from prison after new evidence revealed they had been framed in nearly identical fashion. Civil suits followed. Arlington paid out millions in settlements and insurance premiums for the department skyrocketed. It was a reckoning. But not everyone welcomed the change. Some in the department still grumbled that Keller had turned on his own. Others insisted the scandal had been overblown. A few retired early to avoid internal scrutiny. The culture had been cracked open, and the light shining in revealed truths that were uncomfortable, even painful for those who had grown accustomed to silence. Still, reform took root. New hiring practices were adopted. A citizen oversight board was formed. Anonymous reporting tools were introduced. Officers were retrained not just in procedures, but in ethics, empathy, and accountability. The Arlington PD even hosted a community forum each month, inviting residents to ask questions, share concerns, and suggest improvements. And while all of this unfolded, Melinda Hayes remained out of sight. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't write a memoir or appear on morning talk shows. That wasn't who she was. For her, the success of a mission wasn't measured in applause, but in results. And this mission had delivered. She had returned to her quiet life, resuming her duties for the agency under a new name and a new assignment. But for a brief moment, just long enough, she had stood in the eye of the storm and changed the direction of the wind. Back in Arlington, Keller adjusted to his new role in the Community Integrity Division. The work was slower than patrol, but more meaningful. He reviewed use of force reports, analyzed trends in officer complaints, and investigated claims that might have once been buried in paperwork. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He just didn't want anyone else to be Melinda Hayes. They kept in touch quietly. Every few months, he would receive a small envelope in his department mailbox. No return address, no name, just a folded slip of paper with a single line. One note read, "Truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand." Another simply said, "Still watching, still working." He would smile, fold the paper back up, and carry on with his day. And in quiet corners of the agency, Melinda Hayes continued her work. One town at a time, one story at a time. Not for fame, not for vengeance, but because justice in her eyes wasn't an event. It was a responsibility passed quietly from one hand to the next, like a flame meant to stay alive in the dark. 6 months had passed since Melinda Hayes walked out of the Arlington Police Department, a free woman, and left behind a storm that would change the city forever. The headlines had faded. The press had moved on. But the effects of that night rippled steadily through the community like quiet waves reshaping the shoreline. The department no longer looked the same. Dozens of officers had either transferred out, retired, or been dismissed after a comprehensive internal review. New recruits, many of them women and people of color, had joined under a revamped academy curriculum. Ethics, accountability, and bias training were no longer just buzzwords. They were core requirements. And for the first time in years, Arlington residents began to say something surprising in town halls and coffee shops. "I feel like someone's finally listening." Officer Daniel Keller heard it too. As a founding member of the new Community Integrity Division, he had spent months working long hours with a small team to investigate internal complaints, improve transparency, and make real recommendations to the department's leadership. It wasn't glamorous work. There were no flashing lights, no fast pursuits. But it mattered. On a Thursday afternoon in April, Keller sat at his desk near the back of the precinct, sorting through a report on a complaint filed by a 19-year-old college student who said she'd been stopped and searched without cause. The paperwork was thin, but Keller had learned to read between the lines. Patterns didn't hide in headlines. They hid in routine. A knock at his door pulled his focus. Captain Monroe stepped in, a folder under one arm. "We just got word from Internal Affairs," the captain said. "Another 3 convictions tied to Travers and Benton have been formally overturned. The DA's recommending full exonerations. Keller nodded. That's good news. You don't sound surprised. I'm not, Keller said. I'm just wondering how many more are still buried. Monroe gave a small knowing smile. That's why we keep digging. He dropped the folder on Keller's desk and turned to leave, but then paused. You've grown into the kind of cop every town hopes for, Keller. Just thought someone ought to tell you that. It wasn't much, but in this department, praise like that was rare, and it meant something. That evening, as Keller walked out of the station, the breeze was warm. Spring had come early to Virginia. Dogwoods were in bloom, and the streetlights flickered on like candles lighting a path home. Across the street, a group of high school kids laughed while tossing a basketball. No one looked over their shoulder. No one ran when a patrol car passed by. Keller stood for a moment, taking it in. He thought about the night Melinda had first looked him in the eye and said, "You're waking up." At the time it had stung, but now it made sense. Waking up had meant accepting that the badge he wore came with responsibility, to the law, yes, but also to the truth, and to the people. He hadn't heard from her in nearly 2 months. But that night when he returned to his apartment, there was a small envelope waiting in his mailbox, just like before. No return address. Inside was a single card. On the front, it showed a winding path through a dense forest. Inside, written in neat, slanted script, were 7 words. You're not just awake, you're standing. He smiled, folded the card, and placed it on the mantel beside 2 others. He didn't need more than that. She was still out there, still moving. Somewhere Melinda Hayes was starting another mission. Maybe she was in a diner outside Nashville. Maybe she was tailing a corrupt city official in Indiana. Maybe she was listening quietly in a community center in rural Georgia. She didn't wear a cape, didn't flash a badge. But wherever she went, systems shifted, and people noticed. For Melinda, the world didn't divide neatly into good guys and bad guys. It was more complicated than that. She believed in redemption, but she also believed in truth, in accountability, in holding the line when no one else would. She carried no weapon that night she was arrested, no backup, only a beacon stitched into the lining of her coat. But it was enough to trigger a chain reaction that exposed lies, freed the innocent, and shook a city out of its sleep. And while the public never learned her real name or her full story, some people remembered her differently. A grandmother who had cried watching the news coverage, whispering, "She could have been my daughter." A young woman released from prison clutching her exoneration papers and saying, "I never thought anyone would believe me." And a rookie officer who decided in the moment that mattered most to do the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. In a modest diner 3 towns over, Melinda sat in a corner booth with a view of the door. She was dressed in a soft gray sweater and jeans, sipping black coffee, a newspaper folded in her lap. The waitress came by and topped off her cup. "You passing through?" the waitress asked with a smile. Melinda returned the smile politely. "Just observing." The waitress nodded, unaware. And that was how Melinda liked it. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a dusky purple, Melinda pulled a slim folder from her bag. A new name, a new place, a new injustice to investigate quietly. No crowds, no medals, just one more flame to carry into the dark. The story of Melinda Hayes and Officer Daniel Keller carries powerful lessons that resonate deeply, especially with older audiences who have witnessed both progress and injustice over decades. At its heart, this is a reminder that integrity, no matter how quietly practiced, can dismantle systems of abuse. Melinda didn't need to shout to be heard. She relied on patience, precision, and purpose. Keller, a young officer surrounded by silence and fear, chose conscience over comfort. Together, their actions show that real change often begins not with grand gestures, but with everyday courage. For those who have lived long enough to see institutions fail and recover, this story affirms a timeless truth. We may not always control the system, but we always control our response to wrongdoing. Whether you're a neighbor, a veteran, a retired teacher, or a lifelong believer in fairness, your voice, your vigilance, and your example still matter. Justice isn't just for the courts to deliver. It's something we carry in the choices we make even when no one's watching. Before we close, let's take a moment to honor the courage of Melinda Hayes, a woman who stood tall in the face of injustice and chose integrity over silence. And let's not forget Officer Daniel Keller, a young man who could be looked the other way, but instead chose to do what was right even when it wasn't easy. If their actions inspired you, if you believe in standing up for truth, no matter the cost, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in Keller's shoes? Have you ever witnessed something that challenged your sense of justice? Share your reflections in the comments below. And if you believe Melinda's story deserves to be heard far and wide, show your support by leaving a comment. If you like this video, comment the number 1 below. Your voice helps keep stories like this alive and justice moving forward.